We're good. Welcome, everybody, to the Culture of Life podcast, production of First Fisherman Media. And I have the great pleasure of being back with Professor Stephen Napier. Professor, thank you so much for taking the time again to speak with us.
Thank you so much for inviting me, yeah.
Oh, it's great. Okay, so we talked about a bunch of stuff last time. We're going to revisit a little bit today, but we're also going to go into some new territory because we've just been discussing different topics. So let's start out with something non-controversial like abortion.
That's great. Yeah.
So I think you and I were speaking before that probably the most sophisticated defender of the so-called choice or the pro-abortion case is Mr. Boonin, Professor Boonin out in Colorado. And his basic case is similar to the Judas Jarvis Thompson violinist argument, but it's something along the lines of he'll grant all of the premises that the pro-life movement will take about he'll grant the life of the child, that the child has a right to life, the full humanity of the child. But where he stops is he'll say, yes, but having the right to life doesn't entail you having the right to someone else supporting your life. Do you have any thoughts about this, and how do you think through this argument, and how would you answer this argument apologetically?
Yeah, so that's great. That's a good starting very good starting place, right? I would only add to the list Jeff McMahon. He's also another very impressive philosopher who's defended the permissibility of abortion. But Boonin too, I find myself going to those two thinkers a lot. It's interesting. Boonin motivates his case. There was this case back in the late 60s or the early 70s or something. It was
blood transfusion case, right?
Yeah, bone marrow. Bone marrow.
Okay, right.
It was a bone marrow transfusion case involving McFall was the last name of the patient, and Shimp was his cousin, S-H-I-M-P. And Shimp was a match, and he refuses. He refused to donate his bone marrow to his cousin. And within 6 weeks, McFall sued him, filed suit, and shortly thereafter died.
Right.
But the court went ahead and ruled on the case anyway, and the judge declared that the state could not coerce Shimp to donate his bone marrow, even though he might be a jerk in not doing so. But the state could not coerce somebody to do that. And you can see how Boonin might extract some of the lessons learned from that case, where both are persons. McFall is a person, right? And McFall does have a right to life. You can't Shimp took a gun to his head and pulled the trigger. Now Shimp's on the trial.
Right. Shimp goes to jail.
The right to life that McFall has doesn't, as you expressed correctly, doesn't entail that McFall has a right to any part of Shimp's body. Certainly the state can't coerce Shimp to donate any part of his body.
Right.
And so that's more abstractly construed in Boonin's idea that McFall or any person doesn't have the right to use another person's body in order to survive. And there's a small step from that to understanding pregnancy, right? If the mother doesn't want the child doesn't have a right to the use of the
uterus,
mother's
right,
body, the use of the uterus or whatever. Excuse me. Okay, so that's how that argument goes, and it's been persuasive. Certainly persuades Boonin, and it persuades quite a few other people.
Would you say that's the most sophisticated pro-abortion defense? If you were to steelman the pro-abortion side, would that be the best? I would a sort of extreme bodily autonomy argument.
Yeah. So, in the scaffolding, you have a couple. Let's back up. So there's a couple different routes or strategies to argue for the permissibility of abortion, and that's. So you could either assume that the preborn human being is a person, or argue that the preborn human being is not a person.
The more Singer side, right? Like
yeah,
the
Singer
Peter
side.
Singer.
McMahon takes this
Okay,
tactic.
so that's more the consciousness isn't there, therefore personhood isn't there.
Yeah. For those who assume that the unborn human being is a person, this is the most plausible iteration of that strategy. Yeah. And the idea is to block the inference from having a right to life to having the right to use someone else's body. The McFall-Shimp case illustrates that legally, certainly, everyone seems to agree that the state doesn't have, even if Shimp is a jerk, and even if Shimp acts immorally, the state doesn't have a right to coerce him.
Right, even if he was a brother, or that was the other thing Boonin brought up in his argument, in his debate with Kraft, was that we could even go as far as, because again, the mother, one argument that people make is, well, the mother has an obligation, familial obligation to the family, to the child. But Boonin even says, even if Shimp was a brother to the other guy, still no coercion possible.
Yeah. And I think that, those are plausible moral intuitions to have. Okay, so why think that the argument is inconclusive? Well, first, maybe a technical point. I don't know if people are listening to this while driving, but this is a very technical point. You can interpret Thompson and Boonin in one of two ways. In one way, you can interpret them as providing a positive argument for the permissibility of abortion. So, in one sense, you might say, look, McFall doesn't have a right to Shimp's body. Therefore, you can let McFall die. And applied to the abortion case, you have an argument for the permissibility of abortion. Or you can understand what Thompson and Boonin are trying to do is block or respond to the pro-life argument. So the pro-life argument that they're thinking about is if the unborn human being is a person, then the person has a right to life, and if the person has a right to life, then the abortionist cannot perform an abortion, or the mother cannot contract an abortionist to destroy that unborn human being's life. So that's just a technical point about how to interpret the argument. On the assumption that Boonin is actually giving a positive reason for the permissibility of abortion, one of the reasons for thinking that it's limited, and this is pointed out by Perry Hendricks, he has a recent article, very, very good point, and that is this. Well, let's consider other cases, right? Let's fast forward and consider that we have not a preborn human being, but we have an infant. And let's imagine some scenarios that are similar where the mother refuses to feed the infant. Right? Well, there are cases in which the law has prosecuted mothers who have done just that. Right? And let's even build up the case. Hendricks goes through a couple different cases, couple of iterations. Let's try to make it such that it's not just the baby formula that's being refused, but the only other option of keeping the infant alive is through breastfeeding. Right there.
Right. So they're off in a camping trip somewhere, and there's no one else there, and
something like that.
Because that's what Boonin would say. It was like, oh, well, there's other people possible that could take care of the child, so that makes it morally different. Is that? I think would that be?
Yeah, that might be a circumstantial feature. I don't know if that's ethically relevant, but I mean, because he can't. I would say that it's dangerous for him to go that route because of the availability of adoption.
Right. So there's other people, but there's no one that could gestate the child, though. People could adopt, but nobody could gestate, right?
Right. But they're so when okay, very good point on this. Okay, when we think of, Boonin mentions in his book, the burdens of pregnancy,
the risks,
the risks, right? And there are risks, and some of those are manageable. And if like preeclampsia occurs, there's an elaborate array of thinking on this. expected management and like in early induction of labor or anything like that. Let's just set aside those, right? So let's assume that it's just I don't want to be pregnant, right? But most of those who argue for the permissibility of abortion refer to the burdens of child rearing. It's burdens, and Kelsey Hazard from Secular for Life points this out. It's burdens that occur after birth, right? It's not during pregnancy, right? Why? Why is that relevant? Well, it seems that it's relevant because pregnancy is not an illness or a disease, right? I mean,
the uterus is for pregnancy.
The uterus is for, yeah. Stephanie Gray O'Connor points out in another article, right? The uterus is for the child.
Even though it could be risky, though.
What's up?
You can. I mean, it's risky to be pregnant, right? There's risks associated with it. Potentially, there's complications that can come from it.
Right, and when those complications occur, you would do the management or whatever.
Right. Okay.
But
simply barring those, it's
barring
normal.
those. I mean,
it's natural.
There's a risk in getting into the car, and you
Right,
get into
sure.
the car.
Right.
That doesn't make car driving itself inherently
Got it,
burdensome,
got
right?
it.
So you can, I mean, just because an activity has a particular risk associated with it is not a reason to think it's at that moment burdensome.
Right.
It becomes burdensome when the risks,
Right.
when the harms do occur. Okay, so let's set those aside, right? Why might somebody argue that they don't want to be pregnant or they don't want to have this child? These are burdens that occur after birth, usually, most of them, right? Arguing that pregnancy itself is a burden. I don't know. I mean, you might have to survey mothers. I mean, my own wife didn't think it was a burden at all.
Right, she loved it. Yeah,
she loved it.
But was that assuming though she wanted the child?
Yeah, but then does not wanting something make it a burden?
An undue burden, legally or morally.
Legally or morally, like I might not want to, say, grade papers on a Saturday. That doesn't mean that being a professor is a burden.
Right. It's part of the act. It's part of the process.
Yeah, part of the process. Right. And in some ways we could talk about. Boona does talk about Marianne Warren's examples of in a way. People don't just become pregnant, right? They have to engage in particular activities, right? And assuming that those are consensual, you do consent to the further effects that might occur.
Right.
And so I think that's relevant too.
Right.
Now, Boonin, it's another technical point too, but let's talk about that for just a second. So the example that's typically used to motivate that you're kind of locked in when you put yourself on the sexual market to the consequences thereof is going to the casino, right? I mean, you go to the casino, you place your bet, right? And you understand there's a risk, right? A causal consequence of getting it wrong is, you're out $20, right? And you can't say to the casino director, hey, I only volunteer to bet. I don't volunteer to lose.
Right. Yeah.
Right?
This is doesn't work.
So, given certain biological laws, right, you can't just volunteer to sexual intercourse and not volunteer or not
accept the consequences.
Not accept, and maybe you don't want that, but it would be odd to not accept it given full knowledge of the biological laws, right? So that'd be odd. Right, so in the context of consensual intercourse, it doesn't seem like a plausible argument to say that pregnancy itself could be understood as a burden. Again, if risks occur, then it's a burden.
Right, got it. Right, so if there's a problem with the pregnancy, then we handle it.
It's a burden, and and it would be hard to argue for that without assuming, right, without assuming some premise that's entailed by the idea that abortion is permissible in the first place, right? So it would threaten circularity if
Got it.
you
Got
really
it. So you'd have to accept that it's a natural part of the activity to become pregnant, and then being pregnant is part of your body.
Yeah,
That's
right.
And so
Mhm.
if you're going to say that that's a problem, then urination would be a problem, sweating would be everything would be
Yeah.
a burden, then
Right.
undue burden.
Yeah, you eat something good. Well,
Right.
digestion has
It's a-
certain effects too.
exactly,
You
right,
can't just
right.
consent to
Got it.
eating and not consent to other
got
things.
It, got it.
Okay, so where are we in the score here? So we went down some rabbit holes there. So let's summarize. So Boonin will want to say, getting back to the McFall-Shimp case. Look, McFall doesn't have a right to Shimp's body, even if Shimp is doing something immoral or being a jerk by not doing the bone marrow transplant. Boonin wants to say, well, similar things are analogous in the case of pregnancy. Hendricks comes along and says, well, there are other cases where we have analogous cases where we don't think that the mother in Hendricks's case is off the hook, right? Consider any kind of infant neglect case. So getting back to his cases, so he envisions a case where the mother refuses to give breast milk or breastfeeding, or even consider, I want to maybe expand it, when we talk about access, or Boonin talks about access to the mother's body, in a way, behavior is bodily.
Right, because you're using your body to behave.
You're using your body, right? So even any kind of behavior of caring for the infant, could, insofar as our behavior is embodied, is using our bodies to...
Everything we do.
Everything we do, right? And so if neglect of any sort, whether it's refusing to breastfeed the baby, so I just say, Hendricks could, there's a plethora of infant neglect cases that could be used to illustrate the same point. And he's right, and I think it's intuitively persuasive that, these cases are cases where the parents, I don't know why we always talk about just the mother, but the parents are neglecting the child, and this is an immoral neglect, and the law has historically prosecuted people who neglect their children in this way. All right, so what do we say about those cases? Well, the first thing to say is something interestingly observed by Matthew Liu at St. Thomas. He says, look, there might be an interesting implicit assumption that Thompson and Boonin are making with regard to early human life, namely that they aren't really persons, right?
So really, that's really their argument.
Yeah. So really, it's a different strategy now. It's cutting across to...
It's like the magician, look over here, but actually what I'm doing is denying the humanity of the child in a sophisticated way.
Yeah, very good. Yeah. So that's... because of our moral intuitions on infant neglect cases, all of a sudden things change. Right? Our intuitions change, and we're like, no. The mother would be held responsible. The state should prosecute cases of infant neglect, whether it's giving directly the use of one's body through breastfeeding, or through the use of one's behavior to care for the child. Right? Anyone who's cared for a child realizes you're using your body. You're making different decisions. You have to, your will is kind of not your own.
Yeah, exactly. You have responsibility.
But in a glorious way, right?
There's
something very fulfilling about ensuring that another human being flourishes.
Right.
Okay. So, what these infant neglect cases illustrate is, one, that the moral intuitions that Boonin might be having is really implicitly accepting through the back door intuitions that are applicable to the different strategy, the no-person strategy, for arguing for the permissibility of abortion. Yeah. I said there was a second point, right?
Yep.
The second observation, I forgot what it was. It was just things were firing along, cruising along. But what they illustrate. Okay, the second point is that Hendrix's cases are cases where it is the mother, and he uses some actual cases of the mother neglecting a child, or
Yep.
and again we can assume parenthood here. And the law prosecutes, and Hendrix concludes, or he ends like, so which case is more like pregnancy? The cases where the mother neglects her own child, or the McFall-Shimp case?
Right.
And, I think
Right.
the latter.
Yeah,
or,
Kraft brought that up in the argument, and Boonen's defense was that, well, I want to take intuition out of it. So I just want to examine the abstract principle. And if you're talking about a baby, you're sort of intuition pumping and making everybody sort of have these. That was his I'm not saying right or wrong, but that was his defense when Kraft brought up exactly this point. He said, look, these are, why do you have to go to these abstract, strange cases when we have a very straightforward case of a mother killing her child? Why are we going into some guy who's donating bone marrow or not donating bone marrow? And Boonen's point was that it helps us to isolate and abstract out the principle. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, very good. So one thing is that Boonen is making use of case-specific moral intuitions when he uses the McFall case. Okay.
Right.
Second is, if our moral intuitions are more reliable because they've been curated in response to specific cases that we've experienced. To think that our moral intuitions on abstract philosophical principles, for which we have, few people have any kind of direct engagement or have kind of gone through the mental gymnastics of thinking about these things. Our moral intuitions, just from an evolutionary perspective, right? Just assume that for a moment, right?
Sure.
They wouldn't be reliable at all. I mean, there's no reason to think that our moral intuitions would be more reliable when we consider an abstract principle versus a concrete case.
Got it.
Right, because our moral intuitions are curated in response to concrete cases.
Right.
And we can see that the infant ought not to be neglected.
Right. It's just a basic sort of like foundational principle in human moral intuition.
Right.
So you shouldn't kill innocent things, especially if they're your baby.
Or neglect. Yeah. Right. And the second thing is like that would be Boonen's response there is an odd response, right? Because is he granting the strength of that moral intuition that Kraft has? If he grants it, right? If he says, I have a different procedure, right? You have to consider your moral intuitions on these abstract principles. I don't think I think I reviewed that debate. It was University of Minnesota. University of Minnesota debate.
It was some.
I think
it was a while ago.
Yeah, 2010. It was 2010. It was Kraft Boonen. It was one of the best. By the way, that's one of the best debates.
It was really good.
Yeah,
I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, especially the Q&A. I thought it was a very educated crowd.
Yeah, it was great. It was really interesting. Highly recommend everybody. It's on YouTube. Look up Boonen Kraft debate.
Yeah, no, I think it was the. Sponsored by the
ISI or no?
It may be on ISI's website, but it was at the University of Minnesota. I remember that because I'm from Minnesota. And
go Gophers.
Go. They haven't done anything. I'm just from there. So the second thing is like I don't think he denied that the moral intuition is the wrong intuition. Right, I don't think he argued against that. Right, I don't think he argued that the mother.
Talking about Boonen here.
Yeah, Boonen.
Right.
I don't think he argued that the mother is justified in neglecting her infant.
Right.
No, he didn't. He didn't do that. Right, I don't think he did. And insofar as he didn't, then he has to agree that there is quite a lot of plausibility to the response to the objection here. And then you're left, well, okay, right, there's a plausible response. And, Boonen, let's give it, Boonen has a plausible set of intuitions as well. All right, let's split it 50. Let's just assume 50-50. right? 50% probability that Boonen's right, 50% probability that Kraft and Hendricks and et cetera are right. I don't think that's how to split it, but let's just split it down 50-50.
Yep.
Well, then what should you do? Well, given the moral risk in being wrong,
Right.
with Boonen's judgment, right, that it's permissible to kill a person.
A lot of people get killed.
What's that?
A lot of people get killed.
A lot of people get killed, and if it's
3,000 a day or
wrong,
something.
that would be unjust, and
Right.
you know that would be like a serious moral risk to bear. Whereas the risk in being wrong about Kraft's position, right? That it's
More adoption happens.
More adoption happens. People can govern their sexual lives. Okay, all right. So they have to abstain. Last time I checked, those who live chaste lives are not unhappy and
Right.
depressed. I mean, in fact,
Right.
actually, the last time I checked, the empirical evidence was just the opposite. They
Right.
actually have
Right.
higher degrees of self-confidence and et cetera. So you don't seem to lose much by
Right.
being careful with
Right.
your sexual life.
Yeah, and it makes sense. You actually brought that up in our last conversation, the idea that the first place we should go with an abortion debate is to agree upon the seriousness of the moral content.
Right.
And that's a really important place. And
Yeah.
in fact, a lot of pro-abortion advocates can't go there because they especially the ones that deny the humanity of the child. Because then it's like, well, it's not that serious. Exactly. It's just like I'm popping a pimple.
Yeah.
So who cares?
Right.
And so that's like the ground zero of this
Mhm.
debate is, are we talking about something that's serious?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's really interesting.
Yeah. Okay, so all of that is kind of canvassing or is accepting what I think should not be accepted, though, right? So Boonen starts with the McFall-Shimp case, explained Hendricks's response, et cetera, went through that. But what is happening in an abortion? So the way I described, and we kind of joked about it a little bit, well, if Shimp took a gun to McFall, then Shimp's on the trial,
Right.
right? That actually seems more analogous to what's taking place.
Right. It's an intentional act of violence.
It's an intentional act. I mean, you know, any kind of, I highly recommend checking out the YouTube videos by Live Action. And it's
Anyone in particular?
It's I think it's Anthony Levitino's descriptions of. He's a former abortionist who's converted to a pro-life position, and he describes different abortion procedures: first
they're
trimester,
gruesome.
second trimester.
Yeah, they're gruesome.
The idea. I mean, it is direct. It involves dismemberment. Even in first trimester abortions with the suction catheter, et cetera, that's kind of suctioning out the baby in parts.
Yeah.
Second trimester for sure. So that seems more analogous to a case where Shimp kills
Just
McFall,
straightforward.
and we lose the intuition that what Shimp does is permissible. It's clearly not. Two, we gain this idea that, well, that's more analogous to surgical abortions.
Got it. So your point would be that Boonen's whole formulation of the Shimp case is the wrong analogy. It's not an analogous situation because he's using our moral intuition that says, yeah, well, I shouldn't have to give my bone marrow to somebody unless I want to.
And that's true.
Right. And so he's using that and building that into
Sure.
the abortion case. Right. So you're saying that that's not analogous because actually it's not a not allowing, it's an intentional act of violence toward another human being. So if we're really going to accept, not fake accept, but really accept the child's humanity, we can't kill it.
Right.
You can't intentionally kill it.
Yeah.
And so you can throw the entire Shimp case out the window at that point.
Yeah, it's not analogous in two respects, right? Hendricks shows that it's not analogous to pregnancy, and I'm suggesting now that it's not analogous to abortion.
Right.
So on both counts, both are relevant, seems to me.
Yeah, totally.
That it's whatever moral intuitions you have on that case are not applicable or ought not to be applicable to the case of a organ. Now, chemical abortions are actually more popular now. In fact,
Just the future.
Yeah, a little bit over 50% of all abortions are now via chemical abortion. Right. But just because one is using a chemical doesn't mean that the same mechanisms of action are not at work. There's still a disintegration. It would be like throwing a person into acid.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Just a little small person.
A little small person, right. And that's what's happening. You're killing the cells of the baby,
right.
and inducing labor, right? And extracting expelling the baby. And by the way, I mean, with chemical abortions. Well, quick comment on this in terms of post-abortion grief, et cetera. Sure. None of this should be taken as judging mothers or anything like that. A lot of women are just, it's a common experience. They tell their boyfriends they're pregnant. First suggestion is go to the clinic, right? I mean, there's very little support, right? There's a lot of abandonment. And when a surgical abortion takes place, typically there's a sedative that suppresses their memory of it. Even with that, we still find post-abortion grief or evidence of post-abortion grief, but it's
quite prevalent.
It's quite prevalent. What's happening now is because chemical abortions don't involve any kind of sedative and they involve kind of an induction of labor, women are coming into clinics with their baby in hand, saying, "You told me this. You didn't tell me this. You didn't tell me this would happen." Yeah. And so there's this immediate grief, right? Not 10 to 20 years later. There's this immediate grief, and that seems to be a relevant moral feature that we can't ignore, right? And pro-lifers in particular need to be attentive to the amount of grief and the occasions of that grief. And to really, for someone who has gotten an abortion, to be really sympathetic,
right?
So we judge that the action was wrong, but the person who did the action was in really some dire circumstances,
sure.
and we should be compassionate about that.
Amen.
And we should be the front person. We should be the first person that they are comfortable talking to. Because if anybody's going to understand, we agree. There's grief there. We hear you, right? So that's chemical abortion. Chemical abortions are really they're doing similar things. The mechanisms of action are similar to surgical abortion. Obviously, the means are different, but there's a disintegration. Like it's kind of like throwing a child into acid. But the sequelae, the psychological sequelae, we have to be aware of that is actually much more pronounced than the history of surgical abortions, because there is this time delay that we see in post-abortion grief. But that's because of the suppression of the memory, and they don't see.
There's a drug involved.
Yeah, a drug involved. They don't see what's vacuumed out of their uterus, right? But with chemical abortions, they see it. So that's something to be attentive to, and I do think it's a morally relevant consideration. Okay, so what's the score? So that's kind of the Boonin case, right?
It's just not analogous.
It's not analogous,
and it's actually, you don't believe that he really believes in the. Well, given his argument, we can't search his heart, but you don't believe he really believes that of the full humanity of the child, even though he says so, given the arguments that he makes in favor of abortion.
Right. So, and the way to illustrate that is you fast forward to an infant.
Right. Just bring out the child.
And you see how his intuitions would change. Well, why do they change, right? Because,
you think something magical happened in the birth canal.
Okay. You actually do see the personhood, right? And that's why I'm suggesting is that, the preborn human being in Thompson's mind, in Thompson, similar strategy where in similar statements, she grants the personhood. And she uses the famous violinist case So they use, Bunin and Thompson are both using persons in their examples or in their analogies to kind of motivate their intuitions.
But they're misdirections.
Once you expand, once you do, take the Hendricks approach, and let's fast forward and consider infant neglect cases, a different set of intuitions you find yourself having. And I do. Matthew Liu brings this out quite clearly in an article that he did for me, actually.
He was your student?
No, I put together a edit. I actually have it here. I didn't.
Oh, great! Tell us. Yeah, please tell us.
So the Person's Moral Worth in Embryos: A Critical Analysis of Pro-Choice Arguments. It's a volume I edited a couple years ago. Matthew Liu has an article in there that addresses some of the same ideas here. Yeah,
that's very interesting. I think that's a good place to maybe segue into. We're talking about intuitions and moral intuitions. You've been doing a lot of work and some new thinking. You said before we spoke, before we started recording, about where do we ground these intuitions? Where do we ground our moral philosophy? And we talked about the idea last time of the Catholic Church's magisterium, the teachings of the Church being a reliable place to stand terra firma on let's say when there are contentious moral issues. Could you talk a little bit about your argument here and why you think that that's where your thinking has evolved on this, and why you think that might be a fruitful thing for us to think, for us to use?
So that's a great issue, and it's my thoughts on this might not be popular, but let's just.
We're not going for popularity. We're going for truth. Okay. Truth, goodness, and beauty.
Yeah, that's
popularity is a distant fifth.
Yeah. So let's give this a shot. So, let's consider a couple things. So, let's start with a simple case. A simple case would be one in which, let's say you're having to make a decision, an important life decision, or even let's say you're a healthcare professional and you have to make an important ethical decision, right? This happens a lot, right? Especially in the healthcare context. That's kind of my home base in terms of my scholarly work and teaching. So you're a healthcare professional and you're thinking about a moral case, and you ask a friend, maybe another person on the care team, or maybe you have a ethics consultant, and you ask the ethics consultant. And let's say the care team says, I'm kind of inclined to do X, or I would do X in that case. And let's say the ethics consultant says the same thing, I would do X in that case. And that kind of builds up your confidence. You might not have an opinion one way or another on X, but okay, all right. You take that moral advice, and you follow through and you do X. Okay. Whether or not X is the right thing, the idea here is that it seems perfectly reasonable in cases where someone might be diffident or not confident in their opinion, moral opinion even, to take moral advice from another, right? Well, in moral advice giving, Paula Sliwa points out, is kind of like giving moral testimony, right? The ethics consultant and maybe other members of the care team are giving testimony to what they think is the right thing to do, right? And that seems to be a perfectly legitimate way of acquiring moral beliefs about a particular subject matter. All right, so moral testimony is, in general, a legitimate source of moral knowledge, right? Maybe not in every case. You might, maybe you should figure it out yourself. If you're asking somebody's opinion on whether it's permissible to murder someone,
right.
You
should know that already.
Yeah, you should know that already. Yeah. But in maybe more complicated cases, it might even be intellectually the intellectually virtuous thing to do out of humility and intellectual care. You want to be careful, so you don't want to just rely on your own moral apparatus, cognitive apparatus. You want to kind of collate other opinions and see what other people think. All right, well, that seems to be the case on cases where the issue might be complicated or where you might be uncertain. I would also go so far as to say that you might want to get advice if the risk in being wrong, let's say you had an opinion on what to do, on how to care for a particular patient, but the risk in being wrong was really high, right? Let's say it was a case of euthanasia, right? And the moral risk in being wrong that you thought it was permissible is you end up unjustly killing your patients. I mean, when you ought not to do that as a medical professional.
Right. Violates that Hippocratic thing.
Yeah, that thing it gets in the way all the time. With the idea of moral risk, and we explained it just a moment ago within the context of abortion, but you can also export it to, it might be the same case in euthanasia. After all, it's an intentional killing. And so the risk in being wrong that you think euthanasia is permissible bears maybe quite a bit of risk to it. Well, it's even just thinking that this is a risky activity would prompt me, even if I had an opinion that it was permissible to do so on this patient, it would prompt me to get further advice. I want to be sure. I want to be really careful here because of the risk in being wrong. So you have two scenarios here, scenarios in which you might be diffident or not confident in your belief, and a scenario in which you might have a belief, might have an opinion, but because of the risk in being wrong, you consult someone else. In both cases, it would be the intellectually careful and humble thing to do to consult someone else. And I would, I guess, working on some material here where, well, who should that someone else be, right? And what I suggest is that, well, there's no argument against, it seems to me, making use of the teaching mechanisms within Christianity, in particular the magisterium of the Catholic Church. And I want to claim that a person can epistemically benefit. They can benefit by deferring to the church on moral matters. Now, that's a radical conclusion. I mean, the church has fallen on hard times for the past 2 millennia, right? But I do think there's a way to understand the magisterium such that you once you focus on its teaching function, not the horrible things that certain popes did or the horrible things that certain bishops did or priests, the Inquisitions pops up. If you just focus on the teaching function of the church, which has, throughout time, has been pretty consistent. I mean, when you focus on and also interpret, what is the church responding to in this particular epoch? And some people will say the church's moral teachings have changed. I think it's more apropos to interpret that the society that the church was speaking to changed. Not that the church teaching changed. So you'll see this in the Catholic social teaching. There's a difference between what John Paul II says about communism and socialism and other things, and whereas those pronouncements are well, I don't want to go too far.
You think so there's other differing opinions based upon the society.
Yeah. There can be. It's the core teaching doesn't change. The society to which that teaching is applied might change.
Because the church's anthropology of the human is the same.
That's the same.
It's all the same.
Right.
The basic ontology, everything's the same.
Yeah.
It's all.
So if you focus on the teaching function of the Catholic Church, what are you looking at? Well, you want to think of it kind of like a cognitive faculty, right? There's processing taking place by numerous individuals throughout time, throughout different epochs, throughout different cultures. There are saints who are acting on those moral judgments. And for the most part, we admire them. We admire their lives. We admire, Saint Mother Teresa. These are admirable lives, and they have acted on the moral judgments that the Catholic Church pronounces on. So you have this faculty that's generating moral judgments in different epochs by different people at different times, and there is a fairly coherent constellation of moral judgments that faculty is producing. Furthermore, those judgments have been empirically tested, if you will, by moral saints, and we come to the conclusion in most cases that those saints have led admirable lives in virtue of the fact of them acting on these very judgments. And admiration, right, as Linda Zagzebski points out, does have epistemic effects. That's a marker, an indicator that the judgments are true. When we admire somebody's life, that's an indicator, or that's a piece of evidence that the moral judgments that that person is acting on are the right ones, right? Okay, so if you further believe, this is the last point, the third feature. So understanding that as a faculty that has functioned throughout time, not just, you and I are thinking about these issues, in 2020, we kind of came of age in the 80s. Very unreliable.
Speak for yourself. No,
just a very unreliable source, but
great decade.
Yeah, great decade. Yeah. But, so the point is that our moral intuitions are curated. They're kind of grown, kind of stewed in a particular epoch and culture with particular assumptions that aren't shared in other epochs, right?
You can say
cultures,
that again.
right?
Yeah.
So, but the Catholic Church has kind of endured through these different cultures, and there is a consistent constellation of judgments that the Catholic Church teaches that do, when acted upon, contribute to a flourishing life. That claim has been empirically tested by the saints who have acted on those judgments, and we admire them for that. Third feature now. If you believe that the Holy Spirit is kind of protecting this process, or is kind of informing its reliability, right? If you believe in God and you believe that, well, if a good and loving God would not be hidden, right, God would provide a mechanism or a source of judgments on faith and morals that would be a guiding light to what would count as a flourishing, loving life. And it's just one step to think, well, the magisterium fulfills that visible function, right? So when you talk about, getting back, okay. So that's the third function. You can suppose that the Holy Spirit is kind of directing this and making sure that it is reliable. Now, for the Protestants in the crowd, you don't have to grant or, it's not a premise of the argument that this process is infallible, right? It's just that it's a reliable guide. That's all that's all you really need, right?
It's carried in earthen vessels.
Yes, right. Yeah, that's right. Oh, good. Yeah. All right. So it seems to me that getting back to the original case where we learn from another, we acquire a moral belief through moral testimony in a setting of, say, initial diffidence, or even if we do have an opinion on the matter, we would still be justified in consulting others, just given the moral risk. And if that judgment comes back incongruent with my judgment in the case at hand that it's permissible to euthanize this patient, well, I would be justified in not euthanizing the patient. Right? Well, it seems like the magisterium should be consulted on these very issues that form, or they're kind of the hotspots of controversy and sources of diffidence. Abortion, euthanasia, some of the other bioethical issues. So in the very circumstances in which we would say that accepting the belief from another is intuitively the right thing to do or the intellectually humble thing to do, I want to say are the cases where we should consult the magisterium on issues of particular controversy and high moral risk, namely cases of killing.
Very interesting. And would you say to somebody, I mean, I think that the non-believer even would look at the saint's life and say the same thing that you're saying, which is they're leading exemplary lives. The way that where they might get off the train would be the Holy Spirit talk, where they say, okay, can we forget all of that, and does this still count?
Yeah. No, that's a very good point.
Because, Mother Teresa's great, but I don't believe in Holy Spirits. But whatever she's doing whatever she did clearly worked morally and ethically. But do I have to go along with the Holy Spirit part?
No, you don't actually. So all it seems to me is like that's required is if you believe that the magisterium is kind of a quasi faculty that's been processing moral information in different epochs at different times. Right. And has delivered these outputs in
So think of it as a database.
To kind of like
a moral database
or a data processing unit throughout time, in different epochs, deliberated on by different minds. Right, it's not the same mind. Right. The bishops change in and out, cardinals change in and out, consuls. You have different members.
It's been, as you said last time, it's been across all different geographies throughout massive amounts of time. And so the question, if you were a secular person, you'd have to say, okay, what do you think of the outputs? Forget the people that deviated. Okay, yeah, there were priests that did wrong things. There even bishops did wrong things. Popes did wrong things. But the people that followed the teaching, what do you think? Like, how would you judge their lives? And if you would say yes, then you're saying it should be a valid, then you might conclude that it's a valid mechanism to make difficult moral decisions in your life.
Right. It would be a valid source.
Regardless of the Holy Spirit.
That's right. Yeah. To leave out belief in God, you still have, forget for a second that this is a quasi-mind that's distributed throughout time. Imagine encountering one person, right? A complete moral sage, Socrates, Mother Teresa, or somebody like that. And suppose that you discovered that this mind has reflected on every single moral, relevant moral question, has taken in different ideas throughout 2,000 years, and has even practiced and acted upon these moral judgments, and you come to admire their life. Right. You have every reason for thinking that faculty of moral deliberation is reliable.
Right.
Again, moral admiration is a sign that the moral judgments the person is acting on are true.
All right. So there's a phenomenological, you sort of look at that person's life and you just say, well, I can see that this is good because I see what they're doing and I judge it as good. Therefore, where did they get that information that brought out this goodness? And if they're reliant upon the magisterium of the Catholic Church, then it must also be good.
Right.
That's really interesting. So maybe I know that this is not something that you spend a lot of time thinking about, but we talked also before we started recording of this kind of the popularity of Stoicism these days.
Right.
And this is kind of interesting because what you're talking about in a certain way is, well, here's something that you could even remove the religious commitments here as a modern person, a modern secular tech bro, and you could still just say, okay, look at the inputs of take out the spiritual ones, just look at the moral, the philosophical, the intellectual inputs, look at the outputs in the form of the lives of the saints. Why couldn't you use this even as a secular person in your moral judgment? What would be your argument against that? Right? Would that be something that might apply to the modern person, even if they weren't a Catholic?
Yeah, I think, I do want to think of this argument, ecumenically, where somebody in that situation, I think, I'm trying to put myself in that person's epistemic shoes, if you will,
right, sure,
and think, okay, well, do I have an argument against deferring to the magisterium, even if I'm not Catholic, right? But again, if we focus on the moral deliberation of the Catholic Church, which in a way can be interpreted to some extent without some of the theological commitments, right? Particularly even on, especially on cases of abortion, euthanasia. I mean, there's secular pro-life organizations all over the place. So I put myself in the shoes of someone like a Stoic or someone like that, and I come across admirable lives in the Christian tradition. I do have a reason for at the very least, I have a reason for deferring to the teaching function of the church. And I think one reason why I think that this argument might not be popular is because of various stereotypes about what the magisterium means. I do think that if you strip those stereotypes away and just focus on the teaching function, understand the church as a quasi-faculty that is deliberating about issues throughout time, then I do think there is no reason against deferring, or at least you would have a reason for deferring. And if you disagree, now this is an interesting point. What if I just absolutely disagree with the church on abortion or euthanasia or whatever?
Well, the new one would be the sexual teachings.
Sexual teachings.
I mean, that's the
new.
Hey, like what's right. That's exactly. But that's masturbation. Like, come on, that's crazy. I'm not hurting anybody. I'm alone in my room. Yeah. What's the difference?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So for those. So for those issues of abortion, euthanasia, all the sexual teachings, etc., suppose I just have a concerted, a very confident belief that the church is wrong on these, right? But now watch this. Suppose I encounter someone who disagrees with me on an issue. So just consider any issue, right? David Christensen brings up the example of doing mental math at the dinner table. You're out with some friends at a restaurant. Let's say there's 5 friends, and you want to split the bill 5 ways, and you calculate your bill and you do the 20% tip, and you come up with a figure, and you kind of do it in your head, right? And your friend next to you comes up with a different figure that you owe, and let's say it's more. The idea that he's getting at is that, okay, so here's a situation where you come to a judgment, and then you encounter known pure disagreement, right? So the person next to you, you don't think that they're any better than you or worse than you at mental math. And second, the mental math in question here is kind of complicated, right? You have to split the bill 5 ways and do the 20%.
Might have had a couple beers.
Yeah. So maybe somebody had, different levels of drinks. I've been in this situation before where, everyone else had drinks and I just had my meal.
Right.
So your judgment then, you should at least question your judgment, right? This would be a source of diffidence. Pure disagreement can exert skeptical effects on your judgments, right? There are other examples, but you can imagine cases, or people listening might be driving, but your homework assignment is to think of cases where you encounter someone who disagrees with you, and you have no reason for thinking that that person is any worse than you, is not, is sort of inferior to you on the issue in question, and the issue in question is kind of complicated to process, right? The mental math case, I think, of Christensen is a pretty intuitive case, right? Pretty powerful case. There are plenty of others. Well, now, okay, what did we learn from that case? Well, we learned that when you have no reason for thinking that the person with whom you disagree is any less capable as you, and the issue is complicated, you should lessen your credence, your confidence in that judgment.
Your own judgment,
right? Not abandon it, right? You might inquire further. Christensen is careful not to say that, you have to get rid of your belief, but
Right.
there is this intuition that you should maybe I
Right.
don't know
Right. So
let
if you're
me do it
playing
again.
so if you're playing the game show where they give you like options where you can like call your like a friend
yeah,
of
yeah.
yours or
Okay,
whatever,
yeah, okay,
you
great.
just like you might want to hit the church button. Like, okay, what would the Catholic Church say at this
right.
point?
Church, that's great.
Right?
That's right. Yeah, yeah.
It's like the analogy.
So yeah, that's the idea, is that so for those who disagree with the church, well, I think our lessons learned from peer disagreement apply. Here's a case where there's disagreement. You, again, considering the magisterium as this faculty enduring throughout time, you have no reason for thinking that that faculty is inferior to you.
Right.
In fact, because that faculty has reflected on things throughout different times and epochs and by different minds, different individual human minds, and come up with a constellation of coherent moral judgments that have been acted upon and tested, and those who test them live what you believe to be admirable lives, you actually have every reason to think that your own moral intuitions, right, your own moral faculty may not be attentive to the right moral frequencies, right? Use the analogy of your moral antenna. It might not be picking up on all of the radio signals.
Right.
Right. Now, complicate the issue, right? Human sexuality, right? Where there might be any number of goods involved. And notice we're thinking about this post-sexual revolution, right? Okay, right? Now it seems that someone who reflects on how they came to those beliefs, and they reflect on how their peer disagreeer comes to those beliefs, right? Again, stripping away some of the stereotypes that we could talk.
Right. Sure. Sure.
Then it seems like the intellectually humble thing to do might be to give credence to the magisterium, might be
Right.
to try to follow what the magisterium teaches. When you do look at the empirical literature, those who are chaste,
Right. This is Father Spitzer talks a lot about this.
Spitzer, Paul D. Sellens, he's done some work on this.
This is interesting. Yeah, the sort of empirical social science.
yeah,
What we're talking about is
social science,
Father Spitzer is famous Jesuit, I
Mhm.
think, who talks a lot about the social research, the social science research on people that cohabitate, for example,
Mhm.
people that, let's say the consequences of the sexual revolution as
Mhm.
behavior in the world from a secular perspective, not making religious
Mhm.
claims.
Mhm.
So who was this other person I want to look?
Paul D. Sellens. And I think he's at CUA. And there's another one.
So you're just saying, look, I'm in this revolutionary moment here, this sexual revolution, the last 50 years, maybe last
Mhm.
200 years, but really to pick up steam the last 50 years.
Mhm.
And okay, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it seemed like I swim in this water, but okay, the
You don't
Catholic
even know
when
it's water.
Right, exactly. When I tap into when I push the Catholic Church button on my game show
Mhm.
thing, I'm tapping into a repertoire of human intuition and human moral reasoning that goes thousands and thousands of years. So maybe I should be a little bit more circumspect about my own,
Mhm.
let's say, my own intuitions, because I'm in this revolution right now.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, that's the basic idea. I mean, so backing away. So we have a judgment. So people have judgments. Okay?
Sure.
I have judgments, and I took issue with some of the teachings of the Catholic Church.
Don't we all?
Like I was Protestant and I was Orthodox, and it took me a while to totally
the whole Mary thing.
The Mary the Mary thing. Yeah. So, but when I think about not just so it's hard to do. Phenomenologically, it's very hard to do. You have these beliefs, at least I had certain beliefs. I had them very strongly. But when I thought about how I acquired them, how I got them, why are they there? Why do I think they're so strong? Why do I, and then I compare to how the church acquired her beliefs. Well, then it became clear to me, although hard, that
I'm probably wrong.
I'm probably wrong. Right. The epistemically dignified thing to do is to be intellectually humble in this scenario, and not, stern and unbending, and defer, right? And test those beliefs, those judgments for myself,
Right.
and see how they go.
This is especially hard when you add on top of it the fact that, especially around the sexual teachings, you have a certain amount of, let's just say, natural momentum to want to violate the church.
Yeah.
Teaching,
Oh, yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Like
No. There's no doubt.
There
right.
is a strong pull to come up with some rationalization for you to do it your way.
Yeah. No. There's
Biologically speaking.
Biologically speaking, there is a natural momentum there, and that has to be taken into account. There's the whole apparatus of confession and forgiveness and grace and all that sort of stuff that has to be understood. And the church does distinguish between the moral quality of an act and the level of responsibility or guilt that we have in committing it because of contrary desires or social pressures and stuff.
Sure.
So the church acknowledges that the church's teachings might be hard to follow. Well, of course they are, because they're meant to, in following them, we're meant to live out our eternal supernatural destiny, right? Which is something that we can't, on church teaching, do on our own, right? It requires a level of supernatural grace and help by God.
Amen.
No doubt there is natural momentum, and the church actually teaches there will be.
Right.
in your term, right? Using your term, a natural momentum.
Yeah, right.
So there again, the church teaches something that is a fact of our human experience, right? There's no reason for distrusting it on that
The
score.
church isn't saying it's easy to follow these teachings, or that
not
it
at all.
wouldn't be convenient to have the abortion. Like, that might be convenient at the moment. Like, it might help you financially. It could be a better, if you're looking at it on a spreadsheet with numbers. But there's the church is not using that calculate. That's not the ultimate calculation for the church. Your ultimate calculation for the church is your theosis. You're becoming like God in a way. Like you're imitating Christ in a certain way, right? So that you can spend eternity with Him.
Yeah.
Sounds like an amazing place to stop. We could go on forever.
Yeah.
But I think but maybe before we go, you could tell if there's anything that you've written recently that you want to promote and talk to people about, and say where they could find you and your work if they found what we were talking about interesting. Is there anywhere?
Oh,
any
yeah.
books?
Websites,
books.
Yeah, I have something recently on the argument from divine hiddenness in the journal Religious Studies.
That's our part 3. We'll get part 3.
That's our part 3, yeah. And that's open access, so that's available.
Where can people find that? Would it be on your like if they go to your website?
Oh, golly, where would they? Probably just Google Napier Religious Studies or Napier. Well, the title of the article is there non-resistant non-belief?
Got
That's
it.
the title of the article. Is there non-resistant non-belief? Technical title, but whatever. There it is.
Right.
They could go to my academia.edu webpage, Stephen Napier, academia.edu.
And then you just search that on the site.
Search that on the site. Or actually, there's a link to it if you go to my webpage at Villanova. So if you go to the philosophy department at Villanova, click on my name, and then there should be a link to my academia.edu website from there. I have a book that's also open access. It's available. It was published with Routledge. The title of that is Uncertain Bioethics, Moral Risk and Human Dignity. That whole entire book is open access, so you can see what I say about a number of different issues, abortion, euthanasia included, but also research on human subjects, withdrawing tube feeding from patients who are minimally conscious, just a number of different scenarios. So yeah, that's the most recent. I do have a book project that I'm working on that deals with abortion and euthanasia. Again, I don't know why I don't want to I actually don't want to be stuck talking about abortion and euthanasia for my entire
well, they're big topics.
They're
big topics.
They're big topics, but I think this might be my last book.
You're pretty clear on your position.
Last state, pretty clear. But that's none of that material is in print, but I'll probably start putting up drafts on my.
And you'll put that in your academia.edu.
Yeah,
great.
I'll probably
Awesome.
put that up there.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Professor. It was really wonderful to spend the time with you, and thank you for coming back. And I hope we continue part 3 with the questions of the inscrutability of God or whatever, however this goes. But thank you so much.
Thank
Appreciate
you, Andrew.
it.